At approximately 2:15 in the afternoon on January 6, 1977, Andrew Daulton Lee stood outside the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. He was desperate and paranoid. Lee was 25 years old, an unemployed cocaine and heroin dealer, spiraling into addiction. He carried a paper bag containing top-secret microfilm about American satellite programs. The Committee for State Security was not expecting him. They had told him never to come unannounced. Lee ignored the rules. He needed money for his next drug deal. So he threw the bag over the embassy fence. A Mexican policeman watched him do it. The officer thought Lee was littering. He arrested him for throwing trash on embassy property. When Mexican authorities searched Lee, they found more microfilm in his pockets. The microfilm was marked top secret by the Central Intelligence Agency. It contained details about satellite reconnaissance programs. It also included communications ciphers. The police officer who arrested him had no idea. He had just stumbled onto one of the most damaging espionage operations of the Cold War. Lee had been selling American secrets to the Soviet Union for 2 years. His childhood friend, Christopher Boyce, worked in the most classified room at defense contractor TRW. Together, they had compromised America's spy satellite program. The Committee for State Security had paid them $70,000. Boyce kept $15,000. Lee took $55,000 and put it up his nose. 10 days later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation would arrest Boyce. The black vault at TRW would be exposed as a security disaster. The satellite programs that cost billions to develop would become worthless. All this happened because a drug dealer got arrested for littering. The Central Intelligence Agency had a significant problem in 1977. Their crown jewel spy satellite program was bleeding secrets. This program was named Rhyolite. Rhyolite was a geosynchronous satellite system. It hovered 22,000 miles above Earth. Its purpose was eavesdropping on Soviet missile tests, military communications, and nuclear programs. It cost billions of dollars to develop. Development took a decade. The Soviets should not have known it existed. However, by late 1976, Central Intelligence Agency analysts noticed something disturbing. Soviet communications changed. Encryption protocols shifted. Military units altered their radio procedures. Test ranges modified their operations. Someone had informed Moscow about Rhyolite. Someone had also explained exactly how it worked. The damage assessment team at Central Intelligence Agency headquarters pulled reports from 1975 and 1976. A pattern emerged from these reports. Soviet countermeasures matched American satellite capabilities perfectly. They knew the frequencies Rhyolite monitored. They also understood the encryption codes it could break. They were aware of its orbits, timing, and ground stations. Essentially, they knew everything. The Central Intelligence Agency's most expensive intelligence collection program had been compromised. But by whom? Security clearances for Rhyolite were restricted. Maybe 200 people in the entire United States government had access to the full technical details. Most worked at TRW in Redondo Beach, California. The company built the satellites. They operated the communications network. They processed the intelligence. The security at TRW, as investigators would discover, was a joke. The Black Vault at TRW was supposed to be impenetrable. It featured vault doors, cipher locks, 24-hour guards, and background checks on every employee. But inside the Black Vault, workers smuggled in drugs. They drank while on duty. They often left classified documents on their desks overnight. They even made personal calls on secure phone lines. They trusted a 21-year-old college dropout named Christopher Boyce with America's most valuable secrets. Christopher John Boyce grew up in Palos Verdes, California. He was an altar boy, attended Catholic school, and came from an upper-middle-class family. His father worked as a Federal Bureau of Investigation security officer. His mother raised 7 children. Boyce was smart. He possessed a genius IQ and earned excellent grades. He studied at a seminary, planning to become a priest. Then he discovered drugs. He lost interest in school and eventually dropped out. At 21, he needed a job. His father pulled some strings. In July 1974, TRW hired Christopher Boyce. They assigned him to the Black Vault. Boyce had no college degree, no technical training, and no extensive background investigation. However, TRW needed people. The Rhyolite program was expanding, and they were short-staffed. So they gave Boyce top-secret clearance, crypto clearance, and access to everything. Boyce's job was communications clerk. He processed encrypted messages between Central Intelligence Agency headquarters, TRW, and the Rhyolite ground stations in Australia. He decoded cables and filed documents. He was, essentially, a switchboard operator for America's most classified satellite program. Within 5 months, Boyce decided to betray his country. He would tell investigators later that he was disillusioned. He claimed he had read classified cables about Central Intelligence Agency operations in Australia. He stated that the agency was manipulating Australian politics. He said he felt betrayed by his government. That is what he said. The truth was simpler. Christopher Boyce had an opportunity. He had access. He had a friend who needed money and had contacts with drug dealers in Mexico. He also believed he was smarter than everyone around him. Andrew Daulton Lee was Boyce's childhood friend. He was born on January 3rd, 1952. He was the adopted son of a wealthy physician. They had grown up together in Palos Verdes. They served as altar boys at the same church. However, Lee went in a different direction. By high school, he was dealing drugs. He dealt marijuana, then cocaine, then heroin. It was a small-time operation, running drugs across the Mexican border. He built contacts in Mexico City, making money while using his own supply. Lee was paranoid, unpredictable, and increasingly addicted. However, Lee possessed something Boyce needed: connections in Mexico and access to people who could reach the Soviets. In April 1975, Boyce approached Lee with a proposal. Boyce explained what he had access to at TRW. These included satellite reconnaissance programs, Central Intelligence Agency communications, and classified technical documents worth millions. He proposed selling them to the Soviet Union. Lee would be the courier. He would deliver documents to the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. They would split the payments. Lee agreed not for ideology or principle, but for money. He aimed to finance and expand his drug business, feeding his addiction. On April 21st, 1975, they made their first contact. On April 21st, 1975, Andrew Daulton Lee rang the doorbell at the Soviet diplomatic compound in Mexico City. He told the receptionist he had information about American satellites. They invited him inside. Lee met with Committee for State Security officers. He explained that his friend worked for a Central Intelligence Agency contractor in California. He stated that they could provide documents about United States spy satellites. He also said that they wanted money. The Committee for State Security was skeptical. They received walk-ins all the time. Most of these individuals were frauds, fantasists, or Federal Bureau of Investigation provocateurs. But Lee had brought proof. Lee had brought classified documents Boyce had stolen from TRW. These included technical specifications about Rhyolite. The Committee for State Security officers immediately recognized what they had. They paid Lee $10,000 in cash. They gave him a code name. They established contact procedures. They also told him to bring more. Lee returned to Los Angeles with the money. He gave Boyce a cut. Consequently, the betrayal accelerated. Boyce worked alone in the Black Vault frequently. His supervisors left him unsupervised. He had keys to document safes. He had access to the copying machine. Security measures were essentially non-existent. Boyce would pull classified documents from the files. He would photograph them with a Minix camera. Sometimes he would just make copies on the TRW copying machine. He copied many pages, including technical manuals, communications intercepts, satellite blueprints, and Central Intelligence Agency operational cables. He would put everything back before anyone noticed. Then he would pass the film to Lee. Lee would then fly to Mexico City. He would check into a hotel and make contact with the Committee for State Security at the Soviet Embassy. There he would hand over the film, collect payment, and return home. They conducted these exchanges monthly, sometimes twice a month. The Committee for State Security paid in cash. Payments varied from $2,000 to $5,000, or sometimes even $10,000. They paid more for better material. Lee kept most of the money for his drug business. Boyce, however, took only 15%. This was enough for drugs and falconry equipment. He did not need much. He still lived at home. Between April 1975 and January 1977, Christopher Boyce stole thousands of documents. The Committee for State Security received detailed information about rheolite satellites. This information included technical specifications, orbital details, ground station locations in Australia, encryption systems, and signal processing capabilities. They learned about another program called Pyramider, a planned satellite system even more sophisticated than rhyolite. Boyce gave them the design documents. The Central Intelligence Agency would cancel Pyramider after learning it was compromised. This program would have cost billions of dollars. They received information about Central Intelligence Agency cipher machines. This included how they worked, how to break them, and how to detect them. They learned about Central Intelligence Agency operations in Australia, including political manipulations, intelligence sharing arrangements, and station operations. They received data about United States technical surveillance capabilities worldwide. They learned what America could intercept, what it could not, and where the gaps were. The total intelligence value was incalculable. The damage was catastrophic. However, nobody at TRW noticed. The Central Intelligence Agency also did not question why Soviet countermeasures suddenly became so effective. Nobody wondered why encryption protocols that used to work stopped functioning. The bleeding continued for 20 months. In November 1975, Lee met his Committee for State Security contact in Mexico City. He delivered 4 rolls of microfilm containing rhyolite technical data. Boyce told Lee the Committee for State Security should pay $50,000 for this delivery. Lee demanded the money. The Committee for State Security refused. They said they would pay based on their own assessment of the material's value. Lee became angry. He threatened to go to the Chinese. The Committee for State Security officers laughed. Then they paid him $8,000. Lee was furious. He felt cheated. But he took the money. He used it to buy heroin for resale in Los Angeles. His drug habit was spiraling. He was using more than he sold. Paranoia set in. He thought the Committee for State Security was following him. He thought the Federal Bureau of Investigation was watching him. He thought Mexican police were suspicious. None of this was true yet. But Lee's behavior was becoming erratic. He would show up at the Soviet embassy unannounced, which was against Committee for State Security protocol. He would demand meetings and argue about money. The Committee for State Security warned him to follow procedures. They warned him not to come to the embassy without a signal. They also instructed him to use dead drops and to be professional. Lee ignored them. His addiction controlled his decisions. In December 1975, Boyce photographed documents about a new Central Intelligence Agency satellite project. These included details about ground stations, technical capabilities, and future programs. He gave the film to Lee. Lee flew to Mexico City and delivered the film to the Committee for State Security. They paid $15,000, with Lee receiving $12,000 of this amount. He spent it on cocaine and heroin within 2 months. The money disappeared into his veins. Boyce received $2,500. He bought falconry equipment. He trained hawks. He lived with his parents. He went to work at TRW every day. Nobody suspected anything. His supervisors considered him reliable, quiet, and trustworthy. He had access to everything in the Black Vault. He continued to steal. By mid-1976, Boyce and Lee had received approximately $70,000 from the Committee for State Security. Boyce kept about $15,000 total. Lee burned through $55,000. On a $145 weekly salary, Boyce's finances were ordinary. He did not buy expensive cars, take lavish vacations, or flash money around. He was invisible. Lee was different. He was unemployed. He dealt drugs. His finances were chaos. But his father was a wealthy doctor. Nobody questioned Lee's spending. The operation continued. September 1976. Lee made another trip to Mexico City. He carried microfilm of Rhyolite documents. When he arrived at his hotel, paranoia overtook him. He thought Mexican police were watching him. He thought the KGB was setting him up. He flushed the microfilm down the toilet. Then he called the Soviet embassy from a payphone. He demanded a meeting. He also wanted money. The KGB refused to meet him. They stated he had not followed protocol. As a result, they cut him off. Lee panicked. He urgently needed money. He was deeply in debt to drug dealers. He flew back to Los Angeles empty-handed. He told Boyce the KGB would not deal with him anymore. Boyce decided they should stop. The operation was too dangerous. Lee was too unreliable. So, they quit. For 3 months, the espionage stopped. However, Lee's drug debts mounted. By January 1977, he owed thousands of dollars to suppliers. He needed a big score. He convinced Boyce to provide one more batch of documents. This would be one final delivery. It promised a big payout. Then, they would quit forever. Boyce agreed. He stole more documents from the Black Vault. He photographed them. He then gave the film to Lee. On January 6, 1977, Lee flew to Mexico City. January 6, 1977. It was 2:15 post-meridian. Andrew Daulton Lee stood outside the gate of the Soviet Embassy compound in Mexico City. He was supposed to signal for a meeting. He should have waited for a response and followed established procedures. But Lee was desperate. He suffered from cocaine-induced paranoia. He was also deep in debt. He needed money immediately. He tried calling the embassy, but they would not let him through. He waited outside as minutes passed. Then, he made a decision. Lee threw his package over the fence. Inside was microfilm containing top-secret satellite documents. There was also a note demanding payment. He threw the package and started walking away. A Mexican policeman, Alejandro Casas Campillo, watched the entire thing. The officer approached Lee. He told Lee that he could not litter there. Lee panicked. He spoke no Spanish and did not understand the officer. The policeman grabbed him and searched him. He found more microfilm in Lee's pockets. These documents were marked top secret. They contained CIA code words and details about satellite programs. Officer Campillo had no idea what he had found, but he knew it was serious. He arrested Lee and took him to the station. Mexican federal police took over the interrogation. Lee broke quickly. Within hours, he confessed. He told them about Christopher Boyce. He spoke about TRW. He described the Black Vault. He confessed to selling secrets to the Soviet Union for 2 years. The Mexican police then contacted the FBI. January 8, 1977. FBI agents flew to Mexico City. They interviewed Lee for 4 days. He confessed everything. He gave them dates of deliveries and payment details. He described the documents and Boyce's role. He also revealed the KGB contacts. The FBI had everything they needed to arrest Boyce. However, they waited. They needed evidence from TRW. They also needed to document what Boyce had stolen. Furthermore, they needed to search his home. On January 16, 1977, they moved to make the arrest. January 16, 1977. It was early afternoon in Riverside, California. FBI agents surrounded a small shack on the outskirts of town. Christopher Boyce was hiding there. He had heard about Lee's arrest. He knew what was coming next. Despite this, he did not run. Perhaps he thought he could talk his way out of the situation. Perhaps he was simply paralyzed by fear. The FBI knocked. Boyce opened the door. The agents announced he was under arrest for espionage. Boyce said nothing. They read him his Miranda rights. He waived them and agreed to talk. Within hours, Boyce confessed. He explained the entire operation. He detailed what he had stolen and why he had done it. He also described how the system worked. He signed a written confession. FBI agents searched his home. They found classified documents, photography equipment, and notes about KGB contacts. His father, a former FBI security officer, was devastated. FBI agents then searched the Black Vault at TRW. They found security violations everywhere. Documents were left unsecured. Copying machines were unmonitored. There were no surveillance cameras. There were no bag searches or polygraph requirements. Christopher Boyce had been alone in the vault for hours at a time. He was unsupervised. He had access to America's most valuable intelligence programs. The FBI found his fingerprints on classified documents throughout the vault. There were 25 separate documents. All were related to rhyolite. All had been photographed. All had been passed to the Soviet Union. The damage assessment began immediately. CIA officers compiled everything Boyce could have accessed. The list was staggering. It included complete technical specifications for rhyolite satellites. Communications protocols and encryption systems were also compromised. Ground station locations and personnel assignments were exposed. Future satellite programs, including Pyramidar, were revealed. CIA operational cables discussing intelligence operations in Australia and Southeast Asia were compromised. Information about CIA surveillance capabilities worldwide was also lost. The assessment concluded Boyce had compromised 10 years of satellite development. This represented billions of dollars in research. It also compromised America's primary intelligence collection capability against the Soviet Union. The CIA canceled the Pyramidar program. They upgraded encryption systems and relocated ground stations. They also changed communications procedures. The cost amounted to hundreds of millions of dollars. The KGB's gain was incalculable. They learned exactly what American satellites could see. They also learned what the satellites could not see. They understood how to hide their operations and how to deceive the systems. Soviet military doctrine changed based on Boyce's information. They knew where to position missile tests. They learned how to encrypt communications. They also understood how to shield facilities from overhead surveillance. This advantage would last for years. January 26, 1977. Federal prosecutors filed a 12-count indictment against Christopher Boyce and Andrew Daulton Lee. This included charges for conspiracy to commit espionage. There were also 8 counts of espionage. Further charges included conspiracy to gather defense information. The maximum penalty for these crimes was death. Boyce's attorney was William Dougherty. Lee's attorney was George Chelius. The prosecutor was Richard Stiltz, an assistant United States attorney. The trial began on April 11, 1977. The evidence against them was overwhelming. FBI agents testified about Lee's confession in Mexico. They spoke about the microfilm in his possession. They also detailed his statements implicating Boyce. FBI forensic experts testified about fingerprint evidence. Boyce's prints were found on classified documents. These were 25 separate documents. All had been photographed. All had been passed to the Soviets. TRW security officers testified about the Black Vault. They spoke about Boyce's access to the vault. They also detailed the lack of oversight and the missing documents. Code room workers testified that Boyce frequently worked alone. He had keys to every safe. He could also access any document. CIA officers testified about the damage. They explained the programs compromised. They described the billions of dollars lost. They also highlighted the intelligence advantage handed to Moscow. Lee took the stand. He testified against Boyce. He described the entire operation. This included the recruitment process, the payments, and the deliveries. He explained how Boyce stole documents. He also described how he delivered them. Finally, he detailed how the KGB paid them. Lee's testimony was devastating. However, it did not help him. He had already confessed. The jury saw him as a drug addict and a traitor. Boyce's defense argued entrapment. They claimed Lee manipulated him. They also claimed Boyce was disillusioned by CIA activities. The jury did not accept this defense. After 3.5 hours of deliberation, they reached a verdict. On May 14, 1977, Christopher Boyce was found guilty on all 8 counts. On May 15, 1977, Andrew Daulton Lee was found guilty on all counts. September 12, 1977, Federal District Judge Robert Kelleher sentenced both defendants. Andrew Daulton Lee received life in prison with no possibility of parole. He was 25 years old. He would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. This was his punishment for selling secrets to finance his drug habit. Christopher Boyce received 40 years in prison. He received 2 40-year terms for espionage, which would run concurrently. He also received 6 10-year terms for lesser charges, also concurrent. His total sentence was 40 years. He was 24 years old. He would be eligible for parole in his 60s. Judge Kelleher made a statement during sentencing. He told the defendants they had done tremendous damage to their country. He added that they had compromised intelligence capabilities, which cost billions of dollars to develop. He stated they had given the Soviet Union an advantage that would last for years. He explained their betrayal was motivated by greed and arrogance. He concluded by saying they believed they were smarter than the system, but they were wrong. Boyce showed no emotion. Lee broke down, crying, united. States marshals took them away. Lee went to the federal penitentiary in Lompoc, California. Boyce went to the same facility. They would not speak to each other for decades. Boyce was not finished with his criminal acts. On January 21, 1980, at 6:30 ante-meridian, Christopher Boyce escaped from Lompoc Federal Penitentiary. He climbed over a fence during thick fog. Guards did not see him. He had $14, no identification, and no plan. Boyce made his way to Washington State. He needed money. He started robbing banks. He targeted small branches and one-person operations. He would walk in, show a gun, and demand cash. Then he would walk out. There was no violence or drama, just money. Between January 1980 and August 1981, Boyce robbed 17 banks in Idaho and Washington. He took approximately $60,000 in total. He lived in the wilderness, camping, hunting, and surviving. He planned to reach the Soviet Union. He wanted to defect and live as a hero in Moscow. He intended to finish what he had started. However, he needed money for passage. So, he kept robbing banks. The FBI launched a nationwide manhunt. Boyce was placed on the most wanted list. His face appeared in post offices across America. Tips flooded in, but Boyce remained free for 19 months. August 21, 1981. It was 8:20 post-meridian in Port Angeles, Washington. Christopher Boyce sat in his car outside the Pit Stop, a drive-in restaurant. He was eating and felt relaxed. He thought he was safe. He had been on the run for 19 months. However, 3 local men, former Confederates from his bank robberies, had tipped off the FBI. United States Marshals surrounded the restaurant. They moved in. Boyce never saw them coming. They arrested him while he sat in his car. He did not resist. After 19 months of freedom, 17 bank robberies, and $60,000 stolen, Christopher Boyce was back in custody. Prosecutors filed additional charges. These included escape from federal prison and 17 counts of bank robbery. He faced decades more in prison. In 1982, Boyce was convicted on all counts. His sentence was 28 years. This was to be served consecutively with his espionage sentence. His total time in prison amounted to 68 years. He was 29 years old. He would be eligible for parole in his 80s. He would probably die in prison. Andrew Daulton Lee served 21 years in federal prison. He was held in Lompoc, then Terre Haute, Indiana, and other facilities. He learned woodworking and took correspondence courses. He became a dental technician. He stayed out of trouble. In the early 1980s, an activist named Kathleen Mills took interest in his case. She believed Lee deserved parole. She felt he had been punished enough. She worked for years on his case, filing motions and arguing for his release. The United States Parole Commission repeatedly denied him, but Mills persisted. In 1994, the commission finally agreed. On January 19, 1998, Andrew Daulton Lee was released on parole. He had served 21 years. He was 46 years old. Lee moved to the San Francisco area. He worked as a woodworker. He stayed clean and avoided publicity. He never spoke to Christopher Boyce again. Their friendship died in federal court in 1977. Kathleen Mills then focused on Christopher Boyce after Lee's release. Boyce faced a longer sentence than Lee, with more charges against him. Prosecutors also offered greater resistance to his parole. However, Mills believed Boyce deserved another chance at freedom. She filed numerous motions on his behalf. She argued that Boyce had changed significantly. She asserted that he had matured during his time in prison. Mills insisted that he was no longer the arrogant 21-year-old who sold satellite secrets. The Parole Commission reviewed his case many times. Each time, they denied his request for release. Finally, in 2002, they agreed to his parole. On September 16, 2002, Christopher Boyce was released. He had served 25 years, 7 months, and 16 days. Boyce was 49 years old at the time of his release. He moved to Oregon and later married Kathleen Mills. He worked a variety of odd jobs. He also stayed quiet and avoided the media. Boyce remains on parole until 2046. He will be 93 years old if he lives that long. Boyce is forbidden from profiting from his story. This means he cannot write books, make movies, or give interviews for money. In 2013, Boyce gave a rare interview. He expressed deep regret for everything he had done. He admitted that he had been young and stupid. He felt that he had betrayed his country for no good reason. Boyce stated that if he could undo his actions, he would. However, he cannot change the past. Today, the Boyce Lee case is taught at every intelligence agency in America. This includes Central Intelligence Agency training facilities in Virginia. It is also taught at Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters. Lessons are also learned at the Defense Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency. Students examine the red flags that everyone missed during the case. They learn about a 21-year-old with no degree working in the most classified vault. There was no supervision for him. Security cameras were absent. Bag checks were not performed, and polygraph tests were not required at the time. Students also learn about the extensive damage caused by the breach. One person with access can destroy billions of dollars of intelligence capability. For example, the Soviet Union learned how to evade American satellites. Several United States programs had to be canceled. Many security procedures also had to change. The Black Vault at the Technology Research and Development Corporation was shut down. TRW subsequently lost its Central Intelligence Agency contract. Security procedures across the entire defense industry were completely overhauled. Background investigations became more thorough. Polygraph tests became mandatory for many positions. Supervision of employees greatly increased. Bag searches were initiated, and security cameras were installed. These enhanced procedures remain in place today, largely due to Christopher Boyce. At Central Intelligence Agency headquarters in Langley, Virginia, a memorial wall honors fallen officers. Stars are carved into its marble surface. There are 141 stars as of this writing. None of these stars honor traitors. Therefore, none honor Christopher Boyce or Andrew Daulton Lee. However, their names frequently appear in training materials. They serve as examples of what happens when agencies fail to detect insider threats. These stories are critical cautionary tales for new recruits. Books have been written about their case. Robert Lindsay authored The Falcon and the Snowman in 1979. It became a bestseller. Timothy Hutton and Sean Penn starred in the 1985 film adaptation. Numerous documentaries have covered the case. Podcasts have also thoroughly dissected its details. The story remains relevant today because the threat of insider espionage remains constant. In 2013, Edward Snowden stole National Security Agency documents. In 2010, Chelsea Manning leaked classified cables. In 2001, Robert Hansen was arrested for spying for Russia. The names of the spies change. However, the dangerous pattern does not. The espionage game continues with insiders who possess access, grievances, greed, and arrogance. The irony of the Boyce Lee case is truly perfect. The two individuals were altar boys from wealthy California families. One became a traitor out of sheer arrogance. The other became a courier for drug money. Together, they compromised America's most expensive spy satellite program. They provided the Soviet Union with a full decade of intelligence advantage. They also destroyed billions of dollars of critical research. Ultimately, they were caught because a drug dealer was arrested for littering. A Mexican police officer thought Lee was merely throwing trash. The officer had no idea that the discarded material was top-secret microfilm. If Lee had followed proper Soviet intelligence agency procedures, he might not have been caught. If he had not thrown the package over the fence, the outcome could have been different. If he had waited or used a secure dead drop, the operation might have continued for years. This would have caused more damage and revealed more secrets. It would have also given Moscow more intelligence advantage. However, addiction controlled Lee's decisions. Paranoia made him increasingly reckless. Therefore, simple littering violation ended one of the Cold War's most damaging espionage operations. Christopher Boyce spent 25 years in prison reflecting on these events. He thought about how his friend's drug addiction destroyed everything. He also considered how they could have stopped their actions. They certainly should have stopped when they had the chance. Boyce realized that the money they gained was simply not worth the consequences. Boyce only made $15,000 from 2 years of treason. This meant $15,000 for 40 years in prison. He essentially sold his country for the price of a used car. Andrew Daulton Lee made $55,000 from the operation. He spent all of that money on his drug addiction. Lee then spent 21 years in prison thinking about which high was worth it. In the end, none of them were. If this story mattered to you, please do something right now. Hit the like button to show your support. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more people. Important stories like this do not get told unless people like you make them visible. Please hit subscribe and click the notification bell. We are pulling stories like this from declassified archives, court records, and forgotten files.